Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG jung-helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
I welcome you all on this fine Wednesday evening to talk about the topic of the creative spirit and what Jung meant when he talked about spirit or creativity in creating, especially in general. And I will start with explaining a little bit where Jung has been coming from, because Jung was pretty much a psychoanalyst. He started when psychology was pretty new as a field, and he would first be like a student of psychology, the status that existed back then, and did his own research, came into contact with Freud through all the experiments that Jung did. He came up with some very cool methods to measure unconscious activity from people and laid the foundation for the lie detector, this pretty interesting topic. Through his contact with Freud, he became like the crown prince of psychoanalysis, and he was supposed to take over psychoanalysis to the next generation because Freud was already over 20 years older than him and Jung was rather young. Jung was a huge proponent of psychoanalysis. And if you look into the collective works, you have the volume 4 talking about his journey with psychoanalysis, how he comes into contact with it. And he's a huge proponent, and he's fighting for Freud and his concepts and his views. And this book chronicles his journey as with time he develops a kind of problem with some concepts, and he thinks Freud stresses sex as the only human motivation, and other very stringent and strict rules and concepts about psychoanalysis. So what Jung did not really criticize so much was not that psychoanalysis is not working and it's not valid somehow, but it has limitations for what is useful. And his example was when people have a problem that can be solved by psychoanalysis, it was especially young people, like young people who had a problem detaching themselves from the unconscious atmosphere of the family, people who were cognitively, psychologically infantile and too focused on the mother or the father, or on the mother-father image, that they transported this feeling somewhere else where it should not be. So psychoanalysis had as a goal to bring the children out of the basement of the parents into the world, to not be focused on the mother and the father so much and on being a child, but rather to have this drive to establish themselves in the outside world, to have this mother image, but rather trying to find it in a partner or a man. And this father image, to see it, rather find it in a career. So to channel their libido into certain areas that will establish them in the world. And this, Jung noted, was a pretty successful therapy and useful, but it hit a certain point where it would not work anymore. And he noted this was at the time when people got till end of 30 or 40. And he called this the midpoint of life. And suddenly, these techniques and concepts, they would not work anymore with the patients. And one very big problem is at that stage in life, most people were already out of the basement of their parents. They were established. They had a partner, they had a family, they had a career, they had social status. So they were established in the world, but there was something missing. And at that point, he rather formed his own form of psychology with his analytical psychology, which is pretty close to psychoanalysis. And he would do something completely else with patients, because, again, the problem was not getting them out of the basement. They were out in the basement, they were in the world. Rather, he would take the patients and he would let them paint very often. This had a very specific reason. For him, these patients had a very developed consciousness. Consciousness is the things you know, the things you can do, the things you can do, especially willful actions. And when people are so established in the world, they are proficient in the things they do, in their private matters, in their business matters, and so on. But consciousness itself is, in the end, limited and can fall into this trap of seeing that there's only what you already can do and know, and so on, which means people needed some kind of outside input. Would be why he would analyze dreams with them. And he would do these drawing exercises, because the idea was to let people do something creative, to witness the creative process in themselves, to see that there are things happening outside of their willful action. So not everything is planned for, not everything has to be decided on consciousness and has to be done consciously, actively, willfully, but rather that consciousness steps back and lets things happen. And this was the experience that his patients would describe, that they felt how their hand would move by themselves, and they would start a picture, had no idea what it would be, or had an idea what it would be, but in the process it would change the motive. It would become something else. And these pictures would have very intense meaning for them. They would be drawn to the pictures, they're just drawn. And to have this disconnect between, I did not plan this, and this is not what I've thought of, it became something else. To have this disconnect from the person itself was already opening up this window of consciousness that there's more than you plan, that you want, or that you can do. He did not say that the patients draw specifically well, and that was not the point. The point was rather to have a kind of naivety to unconscious contents and forces acting to the person, and to become aware of them. Because consciousness is a lot of also awareness, to have the spotlight on all the things that happen kind of automatically in the background. Same with dreams. Dreams are not made up by consciousness. Consciousness witnesses what dreams are doing. And those are strange occurrences, situations, images. And to realize that there's something working in the psyche that's doing it automatically, and especially creatively. Things get created. And he said patients would even develop kind of an art style, and they would develop certain motives, but this unconsciously, creatively, that would have significant meaning for them, but they were also happy to share them. He would say, okay, the patients, they're very happy to make a copy. Don't take the original, let this to the patient, but that there is this symbol making happening, which is always this creative process that Jung is talking about. For him, creation in general comes out of the unconscious. So there are certain things consciousness can do very well, like planning and doing something actfully, especially walking in a straight line, for example. But when it goes about really creating something, that this is something the unconscious does, because the unconscious is bigger, more vast, more knowledgeable, more connected to the past and what it means to be a human being, to be a living being. And it's more communicating to consciousness how that could be and what this could be. And these symbols that can happen in dreams or in visions or in these drawings, in these creative acts, have a meaning for the person. But if you are a specific type of person, you create some of these symbols, images, situations that are not only talking to you on a deeper level, but talking to everybody else. And this would be an artistic person, because how Jung saw the psyche was on the top layer, consciousness, the things that you know and you can do. Below it is this personal sphere of the things that you don't want to think about, but are related to you, things that have been hurtful, things that are shameful, things you ignore, things you don't know about yourself. But below that, and this is a personal unconscious, and below that is this collective unconscious. And this is what you basically share with all the human beings in the world that ever existed and will ever exist. And when you have the creative drive from deep below enough, something comes up to the top that is able to be recognized by everyone, because everybody has this collective part in themselves, and it will speak to this part of the psyche. This is what we're talking about when we say something is deep and something has deep meaning. It's from this layer of the psyche that is common to us all. And there, he says, is coming from mythology, religion, spiritual occurrences. So those things that have a very lasting effect, not only on single people, but even on whole cultures. So we have certain stories that we tell for hundreds, for thousands of years, incredible long amount of time. Even the stories in the Bible are likely very much older than the Bible itself by thousands and thousands of years. And this is only the recordings we know about. So rather than consciousness creating something, there's unconscious concepts falling into consciousness. You have an idea. This is already this formulation, but I have an idea. It's rather an idea has me. That's what Jung says. People don't have ideas, ideas have people. So something falls into your consciousness, into your awareness. You're not sure where it comes from, but it's kind of an intuitive solution that reveals itself. So it's not built. You can, when you have it, step back and try to come up with how you reach this point of the conclusion. But very often you have first the conclusion and then you backtrack. Okay, how did you get there? And there's this one Indian mathematician whose name I always forget, who is proving or has been proving mathematical theorems like crazy. Had no real education, but his mind was just working mathematically. It's always his unconscious pushing up these mathematical ideas. Same with Tesla, Nikola Tesla, who, oh, thanks, Avi. Raman, I will say it now so that it's in the podcast. This person is Ramanujan, and I guess that's pronounced incorrectly. And I thank Avi because I think he's remembering me every time. So Nikola Tesla also had this. He had these electrical drawings, everything that connected to electricity, and these ideas would come up so fast. He had to write it down as quickly as possible because the next idea would come. So there is a disconnect between what is happening and that consciousness is rather an observer and somebody who notes down what is spoken to him. And we have this concept of the muse talking to one and to get this creative ideas. So listening to all of this, I think, oh yeah, you have unconscious context that's been forced on the consciousness. How is this different from mental problems? For example, psychotic people or people with a schizophrenia have, where they get flooded, overwhelmed with unconscious contents that basically break apart consciousness and make it hard for those people to interact with the outside world and act normally. This is the Jungian idea and concept of why people have severe mental problems by being just flooded by unconscious contents, which are all colorful, but also strange and frightening. He says, this is not really what an artist does. An artist does more than just recording what's coming to the mind. It's more kind of translation into the current times. So what you have in this collective part of the psyche, it's incredibly old, it's incredibly ancient. As I said, it's the same today as it was hundreds, thousands of years ago, very likely, and how it will be in hundreds, thousands of years ago. So it's very, let's say, conservative, unchanging, eternal, but it gets into contact with here and now. And here and now and today, that's the realm of consciousness. This is how I plan my day, I plan my week. But the unconscious does not care really for day and weeks. It's operating on another level. So it's a translation step that's happening from the artist, from these very ancient structures into the modern zeitgeist to appeal to modern ways how to understand things. And one example that I have, and I help this very often, especially in regard to Jung, a lot of people right now who are interested in Jung coming from Jordan Peterson. And when you talk to them, they talk about how it's interesting to listen for hours about the Bible and biblical stories. And one of the main reasons I hear very often is because he does it in the psychological language, because he sees it through a psychological lens and tries to make sense of it. And in that sense, these old stories, as I said, they are thousands of years old, right? The 10,000s, maybe hundreds of thousands of years old. They've become unavailable for us today. But if you, let's say, update them into the modern zeitgeist of psychology, they become interesting because this is the venue how to reach this more collective, old, eternal things, because there has to be a certain change based always on the demand of the modern times. I heard there are some Aborigines in Australia who, it's a certain tribe, and they have a huge rock wall. And every generation, they have the history of the world and of their tribe and everything written down on it. And once a generation, they just remove everything and write it again. In this way, it always gets updated because it changes. It changes constantly based on, okay, how's the situation now? So the the core stays the same, but the aesthetics, the things around it, the design changes. So this is what artists do, more to bring it into a usable form that other people can understand it, because that's the tricky thing with creativity. You can be so creative that nobody understands it, which makes the creativity kind of useless. It has to be packaged and known. And you see that, especially when you have incredibly successful movies, the stories are very simple. James Cameron, for example, he's very good at it. His stories can be written down in 1-2 sentences, but he makes out of it a 2-3 hour movie that people enjoy because they can always follow, because there's some kind of archetypal structure at the bottom. Joseph Campbell was a huge fan of Jung, and he has written this book, Hero with 1,000 Faces, writing that there's a kind of concept and idea of a hero. The hero can have many faces. It can be Luke Skywalker, Tony Stark, Tyler Durden, whoever. There's some core concept that makes him the protagonist, and we can recognize it. We can look through this aesthetic to see the core, but we need the aesthetic like sugar around a pill to make it a little bit more digestible and consumable. So the artists and creative people, and with creative people, I mean really people who are creating something, they look into this collective thing and are connected to the collective part of the psyche, but they are rather removed from the collective part of the outside world, from society. They are standing more as an individual. Jung sees psychology not only layered inside, but also outside. He says when you have a group of people, you have a collective unconscious, in the sense that the collective group that you belong to, or any group at that matter, has an unconscious where these unstated rules and cultural norms are, where people just follow them. They're not really questioned. They're taken as a given. They're not even aware of that. It's this idea of the fish and the water, that the fish is so much in the water, doesn't realize that it's water, but rather it's the normal. That's just how the state of the world is supposed to be. This unconscious, of course, has also some zeitgeist, some premises that exist in this point of time, but that are changing over time, like cultures change. Like if you look at the church, for example, today and 2000 years ago, you would not recognize it, or 1,000 years ago, it would also be very, very different. Just the ideas and how people behave. And even in the same country, this can change from time to time, what these fundamental premises of the societies are and the values. There's some red threads, but it's kind of a modulation. So the artist, in a sense, needs to be removed from the mass and the group, but because it's not this unconsciously following the unconscious of the group and the collective norms that exist. And in that sense, artistic, creative people are moving more away from the beaten path, the established paths. And for the moment, you can think about this balance between consciousness and unconscious by the metaphor of an island in the sea. The island being consciousness and the sea being the unconscious. So, of course, when you would live on the island, it would be better to be closer to the sea, but you can't be so close that you get overwhelmed. This is then the situation of schizophrenics, psychotic people, that they don't have enough firm ground under them and they're just a play ball of the waves. But you can also not be this person who's on the island and so far away from the shore that they don't realize that there's something like the sea. And normal people should be, or people in a normal standard way should be somewhere in between, be on the firm ground, but still have access to the unconscious. And the artists are a little bit more to the unconscious and the stuff that is happening there. So they have to be there as an individual, as a person, to realize it. You can't really be collective, creative person. Artists are weird. That's all I wanted to say. And Jung saw this really in the rather second part of life, because this is when you have basically explored the island and now you have to see, okay, what else is there? And then you come across this vast ocean of possibility and ancient images and archetypes, because that's what the collective unconscious is made of archetypes, of patterns of behaviors that has so common to everyone that they are everywhere, even in other animals, even in plants. It connects everything very, very deeply. Jung did not see this being as an artist or an artistic person as a conscious choice. It's rather something that falls to the person, same as unconscious concepts fall into consciousness. They become like the radio or the signal. So the signal is there, but the person is the radio that picks up the signal and translates it into music or speech or anything else. So people are really chosen by the unconscious to fulfill, let's say, certain roles, to transport certain things. And he says that when people have really profound experiences with the unconscious, especially with the collective part and the archetypal occurrences, that they want to spread the information, that they want to talk about it, that they cannot really not talk about it. It has to get outside of them. It can't stay bottled in them. He even says that there's a big reason why people have psychotic episodes, struggle because they separate themselves from the outside world and they think their experience is unique to them. And they are now completely removed from the human species and they're their own thing and they are mad. And this isolation, of course, is a vicious cycle that Jung tried to break by listening to the people and saying, oh, no, what you're experiencing is perfectly normal. And human beings have been experiencing this for a very, very long time. Just to have them then reconnect with the outside world and think, okay, yeah, I'm a human being. I have human experiences. I'm not going crazy. And the thing that Jung noted about, let's say, creative bursts that are happening when things get constellated in the unconscious, it's a little bit like before a tsunami hits, the waves recede. So there's a collection of strengths in the background that's then not available for the person. The person notices rather that there's all this energy fading away from them. I have a metaphor. So I studied material science, and this means what happens with materials when you mix them, when you heat them up, when you do something to them, a little bit like alchemy. And we talked about this diagram when you want to make steel, and steel is iron and carbon, that you have a graph just showing the ratio between full carbon and full iron. And then you have the things between and what happens with the mixture when you heat it up, when you pull it down, and so on. And the interesting thing is you can take both things, put them together, heat them up. And at the beginning, it's linear. So you put in more heat, so the thing itself gets hotter. And this goes until it hits a certain point. At this point, you put in more energy, more and more, but it does not heat up. This is quite interesting because inside now, the structure is changing. So the energy is used up to create a new structure inside. And only if this structure is then fulfilled, then it will heat up linear again. And there's the same thing he notes. And people, when something big and creative is about to happen, a big change, all those mental, psychic energy gets constellated in the unconscious to create something that is not quite there. It's like an unborn child that still needs time and needs preparation before it can get out. But when it comes out, something is already very advanced stage. So this can already be, for Jung, a sign of depression or a reason for depression, that there is happening a big change in the unconscious that the person is just not aware about. It's just noting that somehow my interest is gone, and somehow my energy is gone, but things are happening in the background. So the psyche is really working, and you're just not being aware of it. When it comes, it's then again the situation of people have to talk about it, people have to spread it. And there's also no really way to discourage people to stop it or not do it, because they're pushed. They're a little bit like a puppet of the unconscious. They are not completely willful about it. It's rather acting through them. This creative, let's say, spirit is acting through them to create something in the world outside, not only for itself, but also for others. And it is hard to discourage the person, of course, but also, I lost my thought. That was my spirit. My spirit is now gone.
Go unconscious.
Okay. I will go unconscious now. No, okay. People can get discouraged. And he says it's not really the limitation of capability. So people are not doing things because they're able to do it, but rather they try to do things they're not able to do, things they are not prepared to do something. And they do it anyways because they have the feeling that they have to do it. And it's incredibly important. And they're driven and they're pushed and they're full of energy for this specific thing. Because it's not really a conscious process for Jung. He says, very often there's not a lot of thinking involved. And he says it multiple times. He says, artists don't really are known for thinking, especially not thinking about the things they have created. They're rather astonished that it's there and marvel it on more an aesthetic view. But otherwise, he notes that artists rather move away from the thing that they have created. So it's happy that it's there, but they kind of let it be alone and let it be its own thing. He notes that when you have something which is very great, it's outside the artist, outside the person who has created it. It's taking on a life of its own outside. He says, for a good book, it's enough to be written. But for a great book, it's only the first stage of existing, this book, but rather it's growing them outside of it. It's blooming through the time, through the ages, through people experiencing it. And this is similar when, for example, you really like a song or a story or anything, and you want to experience it again and again. And the more you're experiencing it, the more you're finding out details and notice things that you have not noticed before. It's this curiosity hitting because it's talking to something inside you, which is very, very deep, the archetypes, the collective unconscious. And it's unfolding in your own consciousness like a seed from the outside. And he has this example of a creative work being a seed that grows out of the soil of the artist. Yes, to have this current time spirit, this how daily life is currently, this zeitgeist, but it grows farther than the soil. And a plant is not only the soil, it's something else, and it's something more. And it's outgrowing the artist. He talks about how in a, let's say, creative life, you create something or something is created through you, rather, in a Jungian term, and you marvel at it and you think it's great. But with time, it's growing larger than you and it develops a life outside of you. And then it exists in the world as its own thing, and the world does things with it. It's, in that sense, very interesting to have like a living being now, which is a creative thought or a work of art that people then talk for millennia about it. For example, for the Bible, we still talk about the Bible, even though that Bible is now 2,000 years old, based on books that are even older. And I said that artists for Jung don't seem to think a lot, but rather are on this feeling value level of finding meaning in the aesthetics and in the more obvious things. Because in the end, the consciousness of an artist must not really understand what it created because it was created outside of the consciousness of the artist. He noted that artists, in a sense, rather blind and a little bit naive, especially for their shadow side, which is this side of the personal unconscious, which means they are lacking some kind of self-criticism or, let's say, shame. He notes that Wagner, when he wrote his big pieces, he would dress up and do all those things that look rather ridiculous, but he did not really care about it because he did not see it as ridiculous, because he was blind to this rather ridiculous side of his working. And he says that specifically, that artistic people and creative people are blind about their shadow, because the shadow for Jung is the factor that shows once the limitations. So it's in kind of inflation happening that the consciousness is maybe even convinced that all the stuff that unconscious produces is the conscious creation. And saying, yeah, I came up with all of that and it's my idea and I'm amazing and so on. And this kind of boastfulness and naivety is needed to bring it really into fruition and to spread it in a sense. So when we talk about the collective and that the collective unconscious and that the ideas are coming from there and they are ancient, it's a little bit disagreeing with this very romantic notion that we have in modern times, especially, but especially since this big art movement of Romanticism came up, that an artist has to create something completely new, something that has never been seen in the world, a completely new story, a completely new song. And this view is not so old. Same like nationalism. Nationalism as an idea is only existent since the French Revolution. And this is an idea that you only have to are something worth as an artist when you create something that has never existed before in the world. It's a romantic view that's still lingering with us. But when you look in the past, people reused and updated ancient ideas again and again. And you saw it in the Renaissance, for example, which was this Renaissance, this rebirth of all those ideas of antiquity that has been rather suppressed by the church. But at that point of time, the zeitgeist really called out for those ancient concepts of the antiquity to reborn in a new way. And a lot of works of art that we have from this time, and we say, oh, these are Renaissance pieces, they are priceless, they are amazing. People travel half over the world to see them and experience them, have imagery that's very often from, example, the Bible or older works. And nobody would say to Da Vinci, okay, yeah, the Last Supper, it's great, but why didn't you draw something original? Or the 16th chapel. So, oh yeah, we know this story. We're telling it for hundreds of years. So eternal things, updating them, modernity, and creating something completely new and having this approach of, okay, it has to be perfect and it has to be completely new, is something that is not necessarily something that is creative enough, that corresponds to the things happening in the psyche creatively, according to Jung. Because not even nature reinvents stuff, really. So nature is incredibly conservative when it does things. When you look at animals and you look at human beings, it's very closely related. I think the DNA overlap between human beings and dandelions is something like 12%. So there are certain parts that always work, so why change it? And here it says like, yeah, so creativity in many things is a way similar to that. And you notice that this goes further. So until now, we talked about, okay, artists, creative works, music, stories, sculptures, and so on. But there's something more. And this is when people really change the world itself, how it functions. So it's not only reconnecting people with the ancient past, but rather to push people into the future, into the development for humanity. And he called those people very often prophets, because they know of a time before it's the time of the time. He noted that, for example, Nietzsche for him was a kind of prophet, because we are all part of this collective unconscious, but it's not completely static. It's also changing, evolving over time. And you have this huge ebb and flows, and people are on the surface, but not really notice the things that are happening. And if you look deep enough into the collective unconscious, you can see certain things happening there that come into fruition later. So it is really like this tsunami that pulls back the water, but then comes back with force. And Nietzsche was like that, in the sense that you had this roughly 100 years where there was peace in Europe, except for some bigger and smaller battles. But it was an incredibly peaceful period after the Napoleonic Wars. And Nietzsche looked, let's say, into the psyche and into society, very deep into the soul, and saw that there's something brewing underground. He said, Europe will be at war again, and it will be horrible. It will be the most horrible time in the world. And people will be gathered around ideas, and there will be huge groups fighting about their favorite idea, basically. And he predicted in his works fascism, communism, all the isms, all those ideologies that then led to horrible wars and atrocities. And this is what Jung meant, that there are people who are looking so deep in the collective that they can basically predict what will happen in the future. Because in the same way, consciousness is always lacking behind. So your unconscious is a little bit always above in the curve, and consciousness tries to keep up. So the unconscious basically tells you, okay, things that were happening. So when you look at dreams, Jung describes it as a preparation for the kind of attitude that will be necessary in the future for you. And consciousness is slow, lagging, limited, and has to be pushed again and again to see that it needs to change. And this process, of course, is even longer and even deeper if you go into the collective, that it's not only moving the lives of individual people and their attitudes, but rather the ideas that will come up and then, let's say, infect all the people in a group or even all of humanity, that then become convinced of certain things and fight to them, have wars in a very negative case. And here, this is a general danger for Jung, especially in modern times. He says today, and when he talks about today, it's 100 years ago. He says the age of privation is basically over. There's enough food and things to do and education and medicine and all these things that humanity never had and no animal in the world ever had. So the problem is not even scarcity materialistically, but rather spiritually. And the greatest danger are those mass psychosis and crazy ideas that come into people's head and bring them to do things. And yeah, he said this is a number one problem, psychic infection with ideas. This goes back to this quote of people don't have ideas, ideas have people. Normally, in a culture sense, and this is what artists do, create culture, it's to reconnect people in a productive way with the past, to create something like a therapeutic system. He calls it culture, religion, stories, mythology. They are therapeutic in the sense that people can channel these ancient forces of the collective unconscious and the consciousness and bring them into the world in a productive manner. He makes a separation between sophisticated and unsophisticated. During puberty, when you want to find a partner, you can do it sophisticated and unsophisticated. That's the best example. When you are just hitting puberty and you're a boy and you want to talk to a girl that you're interested in, this will be rather unsophisticated. It will take a lot of interactions with the opposite sex to have something close to a conversation. So the intentions of the boy might be very clear what he wants to get at, especially when the hormones are pumping high. But it would be a very unsophisticated way to do it directly. Women call you out for it, obviously, for good reason. So it is this forming of sophisticated patterns, how to behave, which is the work of consciousness and the duty of consciousness. And it's kind of the work of culture to facilitate that and to teach that what are the right ways to exit and to make use of that. For libido, this psychic energy, Jung uses very often the metaphor of water that's flowing. So you have a river and the water is rushing down and it's on its specific path in the riverbed. And human beings are crafty and noble and can come up with ingenious ideas with the help of the unconscious to make this water usable in the sense that you can have some turbine there and create, for example, electricity, create warmth out of it, to make the movement and flow of water usable for other things. So just having water would be very archaic, let's say, and very simple. You cannot just do a lot when there's just water, but you can use it in different ways to have basically a whole society, to build a city, to have technology just out of how you use that water. And this is the work of culture, and this is what artists do. So prophets see when these cultural products become stale and old, because they become stale and old. Any structure at a certain point becomes a limitation. You have this, for example, with lobsters. They have a shell, and when they grow, they have to get out of the shell constantly. So the shell is protective in the sense that they're all mushy inside, but if they want to grow and they want to expand, they have to get outside of the shell, because at a certain point, it's a limitation, and they have to grow a new shell. And what prophets do, and they even do that in the Bible, they warn the existing structure that the ways how they're doing it is not correct. It's basically culture falling apart, and there is a great reckoning coming, and they should change their ways. And of course, they're not listened to because they're so far out mentally. They are, in that sense, more modern. They see where the world is going, but the world is still behind. That they are rather put to the side or outcast, but it's the collective unconscious that is behind them and will push all those changes. So for him, these kind of people break stuff. And his example is Napoleon. And Napoleon was an extremely modern man. The metric system that we have is from Napoleon because he wanted to have a unified system. And Napoleon did, of course, break a lot in his views to move away from aristocracy and to have a modern army and all those things. Extremely destructive, destroyed a lot of things. A lot of people died. But he broke the old structures to create something new. And this is on a small scale for an artist, on a bigger scale for a prophet or a genius like Alexander the Great or Napoleon, the great people of history. But of course, there are other people, not only who waged war, but whose ideas changed society. And Jung saw Freud as such a person who represented this zeitgeist and who was the correct person at that time, because at that time it was extremely materialistic, the whole psychology in the West, to look outside and only see things, but not to look inside. And Freud really forced people to look inside and see what's happening inside of them. So, of course, Jung was a huge fan of Freud still, even after they broke up, and Freud basically ignored him. To have the archetypes manifest in a positive manner, this is the job of an artist, and this is what they're basically forced to do. Same as Napoleon said it. He said he feels a great force inside of him that's pushing him forward constantly to do things and to do more. And he knows at a certain point it will be gone and he will just fall into himself because there will be nothing there else. And Jung notices also that people become so pushed by the unconscious that they slowly disappear as a person. They become strange, otherworldly in their behavior because it's something eternal and mighty happening in the background that destroying the person. All these things, not on a big global cultural scale, happen in the individual psyche also. There's this constant birth and rebirth of the ego and consciousness. And Jung said it's very ironic that his name is Jung, which is the German word for young, because he was so interested in this process of rebirth. What happens? That there's something constantly dying in the psyche, and this is ego and consciousness, because it works for a certain time, but then it has to be brought to an end. It has to evolve. It has to get rid of the shell, and it has to evolve in something more. And this happens mainly driven by the unconscious needs that come up and say, okay, you have to be more and you have to evolve. And the individuation, what Jung talks about, to become an individual, to move past collective, let's say not norms, but rather all the collective things that are already there and make them usable for your own life. And he calls it the symbolic life, where you not only take the cultural products that exist, but rather makes them even useful for you on an individual level, on this individual basis of symbol making in dreams, in artistic endeavor, but even in life, just acting in an individual life brought by the unconscious. And he saw that again in the second part of life, to bring it back to the beginning, where he said everything happening before rather being field research to get known with the rules of the game. But on the second part, you transcend the game and create culture. And this culture can be, of course, for the world, for everyone else, but foremost for oneself, and to have this individual journey of development and this individual relationship with one's unconscious and also with the past of all of humanity. And this would be my presentation, to talk a little bit about creativity and what Jung understands of it and what he thinks happens in creative people and what happens to the world when creative people act in it.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG jung-helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.